And after you have an opportunity to do your presentation, we will have an opportunity for community engagement. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you so much, Stephen. I really appreciate your introduction and warm welcome. Hello, everyone. It's great to be with you. I wanted to thank Kim and Lisa for inviting me into your space and to share some reflections during your Wednesday reflections. I wanted to let you know that today I'm going to be engaging in probably like a 20-minute presentation style, but I promise it will be engaging, that offers us a way of thinking about how to get better at doing good. So how to get more effective at social change. You all already do social change work on a daily basis, and I want to thank you for the work that you do in your communities, because it is so vital and important, especially now. So I'm going to share my screen and utilize a slide deck. So maybe Roxy, you could just let me know if you can see it okay.
Looks good.
All right, great. All right, so let's get going. Okay. So as you heard, I am somebody who is with the nonprofit sector and has been in the nonprofit sector for about 20 years now. The organization I'm with is called the Building Movement Project. And what we do is we provide research, resources, and tools to strengthen people, organizations, and networks that are engaging in social change. So these are just some examples of that work. My point of entry into social change work is really from the standpoint of being an immigrant myself. My family and I moved to the United States, to the state of Kentucky from India when I was 12 years old. So you can sort of imagine the othering that we experienced as we built a life in Kentucky as immigrants and people of color. And so a lot of my work since then has been focused on what does it mean to belong in a country that oftentimes sees people of color and immigrants as others. And a lot of my work has been, my political home, my community home is the Asian American and South Asian American communities. And a lot of my work has been shaped by the post 9/11 experience of South Asian Muslim and Arab communities. So at this point, what I do is really think about solidarity and social change. But today I'm really just going to talk about social change, even though in the Q&A, if we want to talk about solidarity, I would love to do that. So I'm going to be introducing a framework that I developed called the social change ecosystem. And we will be talking a little bit about how to apply that framework as individuals, organizations, and movements. So that's really what you can expect today. So I want to just get started by, acknowledging that all of us get involved in social change for various reasons. Sometimes they're based on the values that we carry with us, our family values, cultural values, faith values. Sometimes it's because we believe that something is very unfair and unjust and we want to do something about it. At other times we're personally affected, like the story that I told of my own family, and we want to be involved in solutions for systems change. So these are all different ways in which people get involved when it comes to social change. But it doesn't always take a linear approach. I have often found, and perhaps you have too, and I would love, by the way, I should have mentioned this, feel free in the chat to drop in any questions or clarifications or any, yes, I get it. I would love that. So even though we have sort of a commitment to social change, I've often found that we find ourselves at crossroads often. Sometimes we're on a seesaw of outrage and numbness. And I certainly felt like that very much over the last 4 years living in this country, going from feeling very numb to feeling very outraged at certain policies affecting immigrants and people of color in particular. At other times, we feel like we're sort of just shooting darts and not really hitting the mark of what we're trying to do, whether it's with a program or an effort. And still other times, we can feel like we are just tending to crisis after crisis and playing a game of whack-a-mole. And so all of these things happen, in terms of whether we're working in a community or as part of an organization or as part of a movement. And I really think that right now, we're living through a series of generational moments that are bringing all of this to the fore. So whether it is the political polarization in this country, whether it is the pandemic and its ongoing effects, or whether it is the uprisings against anti-Black racism, these are just some of the overlapping crises that we are tending to and dealing with every single day. And it's important, I think, for us to keep that in mind, given the pandemic. And I know that everyone has a different experience when it comes to the pandemic. These are some ways in which we at the Building Movement Project have been identifying the ways in which nonprofits and communities that they serve, particularly communities of color, are dealing with the pandemic. So everything, of course, from what we've seen as the racial and economic reveals of this pandemic, really exposing the systemic inequities that communities of color have been facing for generations, to rising levels of mental health needs, really the effects on young people and the like. And I think all of us can probably slot ourselves into one or many of these particular impacts. And when it comes to anti-Black racism, again, in terms of the communities that we work with through a solidarity standpoint, we continually hear about how, on one hand, it's impossible to ignore anti-Black racism at this point. It's impossible to ignore that this is part of the ongoing reality of daily life for Black people in this country. And on the other hand, we're still seeing sort of an up and down response when it comes to sectors in this country to addressing anti-Black racism. There's often a surge of response and activity after we see something like George Floyd's murder, and then we pull back. And there's not really a consistent lifestyle response to addressing anti-Black racism. So I bring these up because I think it's important to recognize that we're living at a time when these generational moments are happening and they're affecting us. And at the same time, we are often part of organizations or workplaces where we are also dealing with a lot of other types of pressure points. And this is a graphic that I came up with to describe that sometimes we are in a pressure cooker as we do social change work. So on this pressure cook in this particular graphic, the burners are all turned all the way up. So we're dealing oftentimes with a lack of resources to tend to the crises in our communities. We are always going from one crisis to another, the cycle of crises, so that we don't have time to breathe, to reflect, to learn, to imagine. And we're often dealing with dominant white cultural standards. Many of these are ideas that come from Tima Okun's work around this idea of performance and productivity, taking more of an importance oftentimes in our workplaces and organizations than it is to build relationships and understand what the impact is of living in a climate where often many people are feeling othered and marginalized. So I say all this because I think context is important when we do social change, both in terms of the political and social context, as well as the context that affects us in our workplaces and organizations, and specifically for people who are Black, Indigenous, Asian, Latinx, and who could carry multiple identities. The impact of all of this can be extremely challenging to endure and to respond to on a daily basis. So what do we do? What do we do in an environment like that when we are dealing with these multiplicity of challenges, when we often feel like we're not hitting the mark, even though we're committed to social change, and when we feel like we are on the seesaw, dealing from one crisis to another, going from numbness to outrage? So because I have been in many of those situations myself, I really started to think about what it would mean if we actually thought of our work on social change as both a lifestyle, not something we do here and there when there's a crisis, and also what it means when we are taking on different roles to advance the values that we care about. So that's what led to this particular framework, the social change ecosystem framework. And I'll just quickly kind of go over this with you so that you have a sense of it. It's a rather simple framework, to be honest, but I do feel that it lends itself to some profound observations if you work with it. So the social change ecosystem framework has three big components. The first is that it is a way to get in, as Native elders talk about, right relationship with our values. And so the middle circle represents the social change values that are important to me or to you, to anyone. You can obviously add to this, but these are the ones that I wrote in: equity, liberation, justice, solidarity. The second component are the roles that we play. There are 10 roles that I envision that we often engage in when it comes to advancing social work, social change work. And these are the 10 roles, and I'll go through these in just a moment as well. And then the third part or component of this ecosystem is that it is an ecosystem. It recognizes and acknowledges that social change work can't really be effective if only one of us does it, that we need to be in relationship with one another, deep relationship, meaningful relationship with one another. So all people who play these different roles are connected to each other. So a couple of more things I'll quickly say. This is a framework that, is multidimensional. So you can utilize it as a person, you can utilize it as an organization, or you can utilize it as even a coalition or a movement. So you can map in different ways. And what I have found is that, people really utilize this for, one, self-awareness. What kind of role do I show up in when it comes to social change? Do I end up playing the role of a frontline responder over and over? What is the impact of being a frontline responder to crisis? Or do I seek to be a healer? And what does it mean to be a healer? How do I get to being a healer? So as Nikki Giovanni has said, if you don't understand yourself, you don't understand anyone else. So I think this is a tool for self-awareness and deeper self-awareness. It's also, as Grace Lee Boggs has pointed out so meaningfully, that we're all about critical connections. So it's an opportunity for us to build more meaningful relationships. So if I see myself on this map and I see that when I look at the people around me, there are no healers, there are no guides, I might think about, how do I build a more diverse ecosystem for myself? How do I bring more people in? How do I build deeper relationships so that this ecosystem is robust and diverse? So again, a self-awareness tool, an organizational leadership tool, and even a movement tool as well, much, if you want to think at a macro level as well. So I want to go through quickly in terms of going through what the definitions are in the, or taglines, or whatever you want to say, affirmations for these various roles. And I would love to, at this point, also invite you to think about what role you play when it comes to social change. There can be several, but I would invite you to think about perhaps the top two roles that you continually play when it comes to social change work. How do you show up, right? To advance the values that you care about. And if you have a sense of that, please go ahead and add it into the chat, and we can get a sense of, in this group, what kinds of folks, what kinds of roles are people showing up in. So very quickly, weavers. So weavers are people who see and connect. They see sort of how different people in a community, different places, if they're coming from the national level, different organizations, all link to one another. They're the ones who see those through lines and they can articulate them. So they're bringing together resources for a community. They're putting together coalitions. That's who they are. Experimenters are people who end up taking a lot of risks to advance a vision that they believe in. So they pioneer, right? So these are the folks who are oftentimes the first to come up with an idea in their community, in their institution, that they want to try out because they think that it'll be more effective. Frontline responders, rapid responders that, I'm sure many of you know. So these are the folks who are able to very quickly know what to do when there's a community crisis. So they can, on their phone or their computer, organize people very quickly because they know what to do. Visionaries. Visionaries are the ones who see our North Star. They know where we're headed. They can inspire us. They can remind us when we get lost. Builders. Many social change folks are builders because builders are the doers, right? They're the ones who can take the visionaries' North Star vision and say, I know how to get there. I know the scaffolding to build. I know the foundation that needs to be put together in order for that particular vision to become a practice. Caregivers. Caregivers are the people who are very attuned to what those around them are feeling and holding space for. And then they can actually sustain and nourish those people. That's a little different from healers who are at a more macro level. Healers are the ones who can actually see the collective trauma that people hold. And so they can see how oppression is leading to trauma. And they know how to, through somatics or through ancestral healing, tend to those generational traumas. Disruptors. Disruptors are people who get into, as Representative Lewis reminded us to do all the time, get into good trouble, right? So they are shaking up the status quo because they want to build power. They're raising awareness. They might make others pretty uncomfortable, but they're okay with that. They're ready to take those risks. Storytellers. Storytellers are anyone who share community stories, who remind us of our histories, who even tell us about our possibilities, and they use different ways of doing that. Our grandmothers are storytellers, right? Guides. Guides are people who are really able to use their discernment and their wisdom because they've been down the road a couple of times to mentor and teach others. So in any ecosystem for social change, we want to try to identify people who play these various roles, because when we have a robust and diverse ecosystem, we can make sure that whatever we're trying to do, a campaign, a cause, an effort, is actually going to be more effective. So I'd love for folks to put into the chat what you think you are. I have no idea what Ephesians 4 is. I'm so sorry, but I would love to know at some point. But I would love to know if, where you fall in terms of thinking about the social change map. Are there certain roles that you find yourself playing when it comes to advancing social change? So as folks are putting into the chat, good. Thank you, Lisa and Kim, for starting us off. Great, wonderful. Yes, Marcella, storytellers do broadly communicate concepts. You might also be a visionary if you find yourself doing that in service to a big vision. Great, so please feel free to drop in what they are. And let me just kind of go through a little bit more. So this is just a quick example of disruptors. So I, oftentimes think about how when we play roles, we are obviously playing to our strengths, which are usually our skill sets, but we are also thinking about our room to grow. How can we get better, right? And who do we work well with? And what do we need from our ecosystem? So just a quick example of disruptors, whom I mentioned earlier, who get into good trouble. An example of a disruptor that I have been utilizing is, let me make sure that folks are, just want to go back to the chat really fast to see what people are saying. Great, okay, we see, I'm seeing like lots of different folks, but a lot of builders. Okay, so so the room to grow here, if you are a disruptor, is knowing your limits, right? Listening and learning before acting. A lot of times disruptors are able to constantly take on this role of discomfort, but it weighs on them. And that's something that people need to think about if they are a disruptor. And Many disruptors work very well with visionaries and experimenters because they can see kind of the big vision and they're ready to do what they need to do to advance that vision. And in terms of support systems, oftentimes, disruptors need caregivers. And when you map yourself out, if you find that you tend to play the role of a caregiver or a healer, I'm sorry, a disruptor, you might want to think about, do you have enough caregivers? So as I was saying earlier, the example here of Naomi Osaka, who, as you know, is a tennis champion. I think of her playing a disruption role when she walked into the US Open last year and wore a Black face mask that had the name of a Black person who had been killed by police and vigilante violence. So again, taking an approach of making sure she's kind of shaking up the status quo of the tennis industry, making sure that millions of people watching see her without saying a word, right? So that's just one example. Some other quick examples, a lot of the mutual aid funds that we've seen pop up since COVID are examples of frontline responders. The NAP ministry, which is a wonderful group to follow if you don't, talks about the power of rest, and they oftentimes act as a healer. Even a company like Sephora, which took the 15% pledge to dedicate a part of their shelf space to Black-owned companies, is acting here as an experimenter and a builder. So from a company to an organization to a person, there are different ways in which folks play these roles. So I think I'm almost done. Please feel free to add some more into the chat if you like, or if you have questions. But if you're using this framework for yourself, these are just some of the reflection questions that you could use. I have put together a reflection guide with a lot of prompts, and I'll share that link with you in the chat as we go into the Q&A. But you could use this as an individual to think about what brings me joy? Social change work should be joyous at some level, right? What brings me joy? What role brings me joy? And how do I keep it going? Because again, social change work can be very challenging and draining on us. So how do I sustain myself in the long run? And oftentimes we sustain ourselves by having other people playing roles that we can connect to, again, being in deep relationship. How do I strengthen my skills? Sometimes we look at the map and we say, oh, I really have been playing X role for so many years and I want to move into another one. So that too is a way to renew our passion for the work that we do and to identify how we can get there by leaning on other people. How can I support others in my ecosystem? Again, going back to that idea of we are connected, we are interconnected. So how can I show up for someone who might be a frontline responder? How can I be a caregiver to that person? And then again, if you want to, you can use it as an organization as well, in thinking about what roles does your organization show up as? How do you fully embody those roles? And where do you want to experiment? How do you strengthen your ecosystem? So you can actually map out your organization's roles and who else is part of that ecosystem as well. It's a 3-step process to do the mapping. First, you map yourself. You find, where do I show up the most? And you'll know. It's pretty intuitive. Or you can ask someone if you don't know, and they can tell you how you show up. So where are you, right? And then you can also think about who else is in your ecosystem and put their names. So you put your name, you put their names, and then you sit back and you actually think about what story is emerging about you and your ecosystem. And that's where the prompts that I have in the reflection guide can be helpful. And then planning or course correcting, setting a couple of goals. Do I want to change my role? Do I want to add more people into my ecosystem? Do I want to get better at the role that I play? Do I need to get realigned with my values, right? Whatever those goals are, and planning to revisit them every quarter. So this is just a quick example. It doesn't have to look like this. Oftentimes when I do my mapping, it's just on a sheet of paper. But this is something I did early this year. And you can see that what I put down in terms of the roles that I end up playing are the ones that I put as arrows. And so they're builders, visionaries, storytellers, and weavers. And I kind of figured out and reflected on how I want to play these 4 roles more, especially as I think about supporting social change movements, which is what my vantage point was when I took this in early 2021. I also learned that I was moving away from roles that I had traditionally played as a disruptor and a frontline responder because I was exhausted and I was burning out. And so part of my kind of commitment for this year is to not play those roles as much, perhaps being a guide to other people who want to play those roles. But I myself would utilize what I had learned to actually be more of a weaver or a visionary or a storyteller or a builder. I also learned that when I mapped my ecosystem, that I didn't have enough caregivers in my ecosystem, and that I really needed to, there are people who are of course caregivers in my life, but I need to ask them to play that role for me. And so that's another thing that I learned. So these are just different ways in which you can play around with this to learn more about yourself and to strengthen your work and your role so that when you show up for social change, you're doing so in a way that's really aligned with who you are, with your values, and also doing a little bit of growth in terms of where you want to move. So I'm going to stop there, and I will turn it. I would love to know if there are questions. I'm happy to answer any questions at all about the framework or anything that comes up for you or around solidarity practice, whatever the case, and just open it all up to you all. So I think I'm turning it back over to, I can't remember now what you said, Kim.
I think Dr. Ray is going to perhaps speak.
Oh, okay. Well, I mean, certainly we'd like to open this up for conversation, and we'd also like to thank you, Deepa, for a wonderful presentation that's illuminating about a lot of things. Because for those of us who've been in transformational work for a long time, our biggest enemy is burnout and people being like moths to a flame. So we certainly appreciate you giving a framework to give us a complex way of thinking about that engagement. So I'm just going to open it up. So if you have questions or comments or just thoughts, and we'd like to ask you so that we can get as many people engaged in the conversation, if you could just limit your questions or comments to a minute or so. So that way we have an opportunity for Deepa to really answer it. And we also create another space for other people to engage. So please feel free.
I can start. Deepa, thank you so much for that. This is really fascinating, and I'm thinking a lot about the just the ecosystem of social change and all the various roles that are required in that. And I've been in the work of social change for my entire career, and it's the first time that I've ever actually thought of it in this way, and thought to think about what are the roles that aren't that we don't have filled. But I can see that when I'm doing work and there are gaps in the roles, then what's happening is the people who are there are trying to do all the different things, right? And some things that don't fit, or there's just things that aren't attended to. And so we're not. So it's interesting because I've thought about this in terms of like, if you're creating social change in the world, I've thought about it from like different sectors of society. So like the educational sector and the business sector and the economic sector and all of that stuff. That was part of like my organizing training. But so interesting that it has never been on this sort of individual level with our own roles. So I'm really appreciative of this. This feels like sort of a missing piece that I've had for a while. So thank you. And thank you for putting the guide into the chat.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you, Lisa. Yeah, and I think, it is definitely a tool for individuals, but more and more I have been training organizations and networks to utilize it too. As an organization thinks about how it shows up, whether it's a faith-based institution or whether it's a national nonprofit working on racial justice, what are the ways in which organizations show up in their ecosystem? how are they advancing systems change? And that's another part of this, that it's really intended to change the systems and structures around us, right? To get better at doing that. And the only thing I would quickly say is that it's not really intended to be about our job titles. We can hold a lot of different job titles and yet show up in certain ways. So I often say that young people are, I think, visionaries, right? They're not often told that they're visionaries, but they can be. Young people who are leading like the climate justice movement, I think, are visionaries in many ways. And so also empowering ourselves to think about the roles that we can play regardless of what our title is, what our job status is, or what our age is, I think can be empowering as well.
I have a question for you. What do you fear most?
Wow. That is a very big question. What do I fear most? Let me think. I fear in the context of social change that that people and institutions and organizations take it as a fad or a trend. And that what happens when we do that, or when that occurs, is that we are not actually attending to it from a daily, commitment standpoint. And I think that even though more people are woke now than ever in many ways, there's still this sense of getting involved when the moment calls for it, when there's a crisis, and then kind of stepping back or just not doing anything else. And so that's what I fear most. As someone who's also been engaged in social change work for most of my life, I want to see more people come in and get involved, but I also worry about not just burnout, but I worry that people don't have enough entryways or entry paths to sustain their interest beyond, we need to go out to this rally, or we need to put together this mutual aid response to COVID. It has to be something that is a lifestyle choice. And I think that's what I fear, that it just comes up, it ebbs and flows too much so that it doesn't create the change that we want to see. But thank you for that. I'm going to keep thinking about that question.
Greg Mooson, why don't you ask that question that you put into the chat?
So often in leadership with religious leaders, especially smaller parishes or religious organizations, the clergy person, the ordained person, the one that's denomination gives us authority to, is asked to do all 10 roles. And the numbers in a parish may call for some of that, but any advice you might have?
Yeah, thank you for that. I can absolutely see how that individual is asked to play all 10 roles. And that's something that I often also see in the nonprofit space, where the executive director is asked to play all 10 roles. So one of the reasons for this framework is that we want to actually not do that. We want to figure out how to set boundaries. We want to actually ensure that the community, whether it's a parish or a board, recognizes that no one person can play all those 10 roles. They might not have the skills, they might not have the ability, they might not want to. And so how does the ecosystem around that person actually identify others who can be empowered to play many of those roles? And then the last thing I'll quickly say is that many of us do cycle in and out of those roles throughout the course of our lives, or depending on context. And so it could be the case that you fall into all of those roles, have played all those roles at some point, right? Depending on what's happening. And that's okay. That's how we learn. That's how we strengthen our practice. That's how we actually guide other people who are also in it. But that's my advice, to actually identify boundaries, to get clear on the roles that one really needs to play and wants to play, and then to ask the ecosystem, if that's possible, around that person, to actually identify others who can be empowered to play roles. And if that doesn't happen, that's when we get to like that burnout and the fatigue and all of that.
Let me ask you a quick question, Deepa. One of the things that I've been thinking about of late is the problem of, and it's a perennial problem of passing along generational knowledge in ways that it can equip social change. So for instance, a couple of things I reflected on in the last couple of weeks. One is that I actually had better health coverage when I was a maintenance worker at J.C. Penney's in 1980 than I do now today as a seminary president. And when I look back, I actually had more rights as a voter in some places in this nation 40 years ago than I do now. And, I really want to focus the question because I think in 2016, one of my greatest despairs was that people of certainly my generation who had been activists were trying to tell the new generation, be very afraid of what this means if this person is elected. And then we began to, but in many squares of activism, that wasn't heard, or it was heard in ways that it wasn't motivating. So now the next generation, the current generation of activists will probably have to spend the next 30 years getting back and protecting and fighting for rights that they had in 2008. So how do you think about that? Because when we lose these major battles, it means we have to fight for a very long time to get things back.
Yeah, thank you for that. I'm also sorry to hear that some of those comparisons that you made, because that's not the way it should be. Yeah, I mean, I think that more people than ever understand that the role of leadership and political leadership and policy is extremely significant. It can mean, the difference between survival and not. It can mean the difference between having your rights and not. So I do think that that's obviously happened over the last 4 years. But in terms of people kind of passing on generational knowledge and other people being in a space to receive it, what I think is important, and I don't think that we do enough of this perhaps, is that component of being the storyteller and being the guide. I think it's really important in any social change ecosystem that we're part of, that those of us who have done that work are able to actually play that role. Oftentimes when we have crises, it really goes to the frontline responders and the disruptors. They kind of take that visibility because the crisis needs to be responded to, and that's super important. But so is the role of actually storytelling, to talk about the arc of where we've been, where we could go if we aren't careful. So I think more time in our society to learn from one another, reflect, teach, guide, tell stories is absolutely important. I could say from my experience, I did play the role of a frontline responder over the past 4 years, primarily because of the policies that were attacking Muslim communities, like the Muslim ban, given the work that I had done after 9/11. And we spent a lot of time doing teach-ins. That's what I did. I spent time teaching younger activists who were all of a sudden catalyzed about the 15 years before. What was it like right after 9/11? What did we do then? What did we build? What did we not do? So that people had a better sense of doing the frontline responder role in response to something like the Muslim ban. So I think taking that time, which we don't have when we're facing a crisis, is something that we need to build into the work that we do.
Thank you. Other questions or comments? Now, I know that part of what the problem is that you are talking to a group of people that are always in the thick of something. So like 1,000 things are going on in people's minds at the moment. So even if it's nothing more than you telling us what's going on inside your head, that you can't quite cogently form into a question, but you think it was important for us to hear. Why don't you spend some time sharing that with us?
Do you mean me or the participants?
No, the participants. So
Right,
that
right. That's
way-
what I thought.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. So that way, we'll have a broader range of engagement, because people are thinking about so much that they don't want to ask a question that sounds simple. So just tell us what's going on inside your heads at the moment.
I will pick up on that one, because after I'm going to tell a story, not ask a question. The story has to do with CTS. I was a graduate in 1957 and again in 2017. And the 2017 one was 2 years of study and reflection. It was almost like a sabbatical after 55 years in the war. And I took a break, and it was very renewing, and it brought me into focus on both what I had been doing and what needed to be done yet. And I thank CTS for that very much.
Mhm.
I also am loving I mean, I'm a storyteller, so I love the idea of storytellers, and the role that storytellers serve in this work. And also um, your point about reflection and just giving time for reflection, I think is pretty powerful in this work. And that's kind of connected to what you were just saying, Robinson.
In your ecosystem, uh, and again, it was only 20 minutes, I'm sure it goes much deeper if we get into your material. It's almost like almost all those folks are pulling in the same direction. In our polarized work today, with race being such a critical issue in anti-racism, uh, what happens when some of the folks in that organization are different races and aren't always pulling in the same direction, or even not having the bridges perhaps to work that out? It's not as two-dimensional, right? There's a lot of other levels to that. So I'd just be curious how you
Yeah.
work through some of that.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Which is why sort of one of the first steps is really to get alignment on values. And that's where, we want to start, to understand what our values are. And I think that, many of us utilize words like solidarity or justice, equity all the time now. But taking that time again to understand, what does that particular that value mean for me? What does it actually mean for my community? What does it actually mean for my institution? Is something that we really want to spend some time doing. So the values alignment is one of the first things. And as you said, Craig, I mean, there could be people who don't agree, right? Or who don't know, or who don't understand. And so I think taking the time to actually have that conversation about values is extremely important. If there are people that don't agree, if there are people who feel like, well, I don't believe in equity, I don't believe in solidarity, that should open up a conversation about who is in your ecosystem. I think that's different from, for example, if you are working with a congregation or an organization of people that hold different beliefs, that's different. But hopefully, as someone I think wrote on here, if you are part of an institution, you want to make sure that works on social change, you want to be aligned in terms of what the values are. I also often encourage people who have some influence over a network or a community to really think about playing the role of a disruptor. What does it mean to actually make a speech or to talk to a group of people who might actually have different value sets about solidarity and justice? What does it mean to take a stand and talk about that, right? That could make people uncomfortable. That could make, some people might say, well, this is not the space to have these conversations. All of those responses we have, or some people have, I would say, when it comes to discussing anti-racism or equity. I think being a disruptor is something that all of us should be thinking about, especially if we have privilege, if we have positionality and power. How can we actually utilize power and positionality in a way that is aligned again with the values that we care about? How do we disrupt other people's comfort levels by actually leaning in to those values and making them a little uncomfortable? So that's a challenge that I always have for all of us. And it's also connected to solidarity, because with solidarity, again, it's a practice, not like a verb. It's a verb. It's not, something that's just a lofty ideal. And practicing solidarity oftentimes means that we actually take a risk and we utilize our power, we utilize our positionality and our influence in favor of or on behalf of other people. So it could mean everything from, if I'm someone who has access to policymakers, I will open the door for communities who never get a seat at the table. If I'm someone who is always receiving funding, I will say to the funder, you know what, this go around, we actually want to identify other organizations in our networks to get that funding. So it's identifying, where do I have some amount of influence and power? And how do I utilize the role of a disruptor? How do I play the role of a disruptor to advance the values that I care about? So that's another way of thinking about, if you are working with a group of people who might have different values, how to play your disruptor role.
Thank you.
If I could ask you one more question, Deepa, and I'm not trying to monopolize here, but I will take advantage of the silence for the moment. I think I'd like to get your thoughts on a dimension of privilege and positionality and the responsibility that comes with that when you are trying to engage in solidarity with other communities. And, I'm going to root this question in sort of a comment. So probably I didn't begin referring to myself again as a progressive until probably early 2020, because by the end of November of 2016, I felt like those of us who were, particularly in the Black community, but many Brown communities, who were running around with our hair on fire saying, we cannot let this happen, because if we lose the Supreme Court, we will be fighting a rearguard action for decades to come. And many of our progressive allies, and for me, I put that in quotes, were sort of living into the privilege that they could prioritize other sorts of issues that would lead them not to bring their full force to the battlefield, as it were. So there were many like me who felt like we were in the thick of this fight that would be life defining for the rest of us. And I looked over my shoulder and folk were gone. They weren't fighting with us anymore. They were standing with the tribe of folded arms saying, we're going to teach you a lesson about not listening to us, right? So, dealing with that, because I will say that that's the kind of fracture that can take decades to repair, because when people don't feel like they can depend on you anymore, it's hard to build solidarity. So how, what would you help us to think about privilege and positionality and the responsibility, not just the opportunity to help others, but the responsibility that even if we can walk away unscathed, we don't, because our allies are going to be paying a grievous price for some time to come.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that. I guess I would just start by saying that, if we truly care about solidarity and we want to practice it, right, it has to go beyond like the hashtags and the slogans, and it has to go beyond the signs. And what it often means is that, we have sort of these 5 principles for transformative solidarity practice we talk about, including centering, like who are we centering, right? Are we centering the experiences of people who have often been on the margins? And are we not just speaking for them, but we're creating space so that they speak for themselves? Another principle, which I think relates to what you might be talking about, is being a co-conspirator. I don't use the word allyship as much. I use the word co-conspirator. And I think the reason for that is because oftentimes we have to really think about allyship. Oftentimes can seem passive, like, oh, I'm an ally, but that doesn't mean I really do anything. I just kind of, I'm, you know, I try to be an upstander or whatever that means. But if you're a co-conspirator, it means that you're one, or an accomplice, you're building relationships with people that you care about. So if I am someone who is a white person, right, and I care about ending anti-Black racism, I'm actually taking the time to build relationships with Black communities, with Black people, right? I'm not just parachuting in and coming out when I feel like it. I'm also thinking about what does the cause that Black people might be fighting for in my community mean for me and my community, right? There is, every single one of us should have a commitment to ending anti-Black racism, not just for Black communities, right? But because we understand that when there is no anti-Black racism, there will be no cause for anyone to actually face racism in this country. And I think having that understanding is really important because it can then get us to the question of why is this important to me as well? And then we have to think about how are we going to take the risks? And it is risky. It is something where we might have to do something that is going to shake up, you know, a family relationship we have, because we're going to say something, we're going to disrupt, we're going to intervene, and it could have some pain. There could be some pain involved with that. So I think that thinking about ourselves as co-conspirators, thinking about ourselves as people who are not just in it as allies or in it for the hashtags and whatever Facebook posts we're putting up on that day, right? But how is it a day-to-day struggle that is, again, centering the experiences and perspectives and demands of people who are affected the most by inequity in this country, and then standing with them. So I think that that's the sort of way to think about it that can, again, allow us to be in transformative solidarity as opposed to a lot of transactional solidarity that ends up happening.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the wonderful presentation. Thank you for engaging us deeply in these conversations. Friends, if you would raise hands as a sign of thanks or clap as you feel moved. We do want to thank you, Deepa Iyer, for the conversation and for the opportunity to learn. Before we close,